up here. So our next speaker is Debo Powers. She lives in Polbridge and has been paddling the North Fork of the Flathead River for more than 35 years. She is president of the North Fork Preservation Association, which is an organization which works to protect the watershed, wilderness, and wildlife of the North Fork River Valley.
Thank you. Oh, this is way too tall for me. I guess they only have tall people around here.
You can use it to hide behind if you want.
That would be good.
Do you want to use the microphone if you wish?
Let's see how this
I-
works. Let's see. Okay. Can you hear me better? Okay. Well, a wild and scenic river runs through my home because my home is the North Fork of the Flathead River Valley. And every drop of moisture, like we have today, every bit of rain and snow and hail and sleet and fog, every drop of moisture that falls on the North Fork Valley runs to the river. And on its way to the river, it nourishes the richest, or one of the richest and most diverse ecosystems on the whole planet. It's like the river is the lifeblood of the valley. And I don't know about you, but I love standing on a ridge in the moonlight and seeing how the light transforms the river, and I can see it as a silver ribbon through the landscape. And I love to get out on the river in my kayak and let it carry me down with the sun on my shoulders and the clear water all around and the trees and seeing the wildlife on the shore. I just love that. I know you do too. I love breathing in the serenity of the surrounding mountains and the trees and noticing the wildlife. I love how the river takes away all my worries and all my distresses like they never were there before. And sometimes, if I'm really present and I really listen to the river, she whispers to me about ancient truths that are contrary to what I hear in human civilization. She says to me things like, you are not alone. You are not separate. You are not superior. You are a part of me, and you are a part of all the wildlands around you. You are not separate. I love those teachings that she gives me. Well, the headwaters of this wise and wondrous river starts in Canada, and it meanders through exquisite wild country that used to be the territory of the Nataha Nation. And when that river meets the Canadian-US border, it magically changes its name from the Flathead River to the North Fork of the Flathead River. Imagine that. And it forms the western boundary of Glacier National Park. Well, this wonderful valley, the North Fork Valley, has not had human interference for very many years. Maybe only about 120 years, which isn't very long when you think of geological time. It's not very long at all. In fact, the first people who came to Montana about 11,000 years ago came into Montana on the east side of the Continental Divide, and through all those thousands of years that indigenous people were here, none of them made the North Fork Valley their permanent home. That land was land of the Kootenai Nation, and the Kootenai lived west of the North Fork Valley on the other side of the Whitefish Range. And they used the North Fork Valley for hunting and for vision quests, and to travel through the valley to cross the Continental Divide, to hunt for buffalo, and bring food back to their villages. So there weren't any real permanent settlements in the North Fork Valley until really late in the 1800s. And in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, European settlers moved into the valley because of the Homestead Act. And most of them claimed land along the river. And and they lived there, and there were settlers there, but you know, that valley still remained pretty low population and pretty isolated. And even today, in the North Fork Valley, it's a pretty small population. There's only about 50 or 60 of us who live there full time. And we're off the grid, off the electric grid, and we don't have traditional phone systems, and we have mostly gravel roads, and we love living like that. But despite the fact that thousands of people come in there in the North Fork Valley in the summertime, the North Fork Valley is still pretty wild. And it's wild because it stretches between the Livingston Range on the east in the Glacier National Park to the Whitefish Range in the Flathead National Forest. And it's pretty wild country because 96% of it is public land. And only about 4% of it is privately owned. Most of that's along the river. So sometimes if you go to the North Fork, you think it might be highly populated. Well, most of that population is along the river. And so 96% of it is public land, and it's wild land, it's undeveloped. And that is what makes the North Fork so special, is all that public land. Mostly humans have tried to learn how to live in harmony with the wild North Fork. But at times in our history, there have been groups of people who have come in to make a profit off the land in certain ways. Like the first oil well in Montana was drilled in 1901 at Kentla Lake, or near Kentla Lake, if you can imagine that. That's in Glacier National Park now. But they drilled an oil well there, and luckily they went bankrupt in about 3 years. So later it became Glacier National Park. But during the 70s and 80s, there were attempts to have more oil drilling in the North Fork. And people fought that. There were people who fought that. That's what I want you to know, is that people for decades have been fighting to protect the North Fork Valley and the North Fork of the Flathead River. And so they fought it and they defeated it. And those oil wells were never drilled in the North Fork. And people also defeated the Cabin Creek coal mine, which was on a tributary to the Flathead River in Canada. And so there have been decades of people who have really tried to keep the North Fork wild and special. The culmination of this was just a couple of years ago with the North Fork Watershed Protection Act that passed Congress in 2015. And this act banned fossil fuel development in the North Fork forever. Hey, that's something we can celebrate. Woo! So there have been a lot of threats to the river, but the river is clean and beautiful and pristine because so many people have worked to keep it that way. One of the threats to the North Fork was a planned dam in the 1940s. They were planning to dam the river. And that dam, it would be called the Glacier View Dam. It was near Glacier View Mountain, right there in the canyon. The dam would be close to where the Camas Road crosses the river and goes into the park. And they defeated that dam too. Yay! So by 1950, all those plans were done away with. That was thanks to lots of people who worked hard on it, and also the Park Service that came out against it. If that dam had been allowed to be built, most of the North Fork Valley would be a giant reservoir, and you would never get to float the wild and scenic North Fork River. It wouldn't be there. So thanks to those people. So when the Wild and Scenic River Act passed in 1968, right, 1968, people who wanted to save the North Fork, protect the North Fork, were thrilled about that. But not all the landowners were thrilled. There were people who lived in the North Fork who thought that that was federal government interference. There were other people who thought, just leave us alone, we're up here far from civilization, just leave us alone, don't do that. There were other people who were afraid that designation of the river would cause lots of people to come into the North Fork Valley. And actually over time that has happened. And so our biggest challenge now with the river is to figure out how to keep protecting the river despite all the thousands of people who come in to use the river. And so we're still trying to figure that out. And we need to work on that. So what I want to tell you is that I live on the North Fork of the Flathead River. It is my river, but it is a river that I share with all of you, every one of you, because that river was designated and it was protected for all of us and for future generations. Thankfully, somebody did that, and they did that so that all of us can enjoy the beauty and the solace that that river has to offer. But it's also important to realize that we have a responsibility to the river, that we need to treat it well, that we need to follow the rules that are meant to protect it, that we need to enter the wild country of the river and the wild country of the North Fork with reverence and respect. That the river is not just our playground. It's not just our playground. It is the home of lots of wild creatures and an ecosystem that is intricate and magnificent and has much to teach us if we just pay attention and listen. So I invite you to not be just a consumer of the river, to not just think about what the river can do for you, for your pleasure and your enjoyment, not just be a consumer, but to be an advocate for the river, to be an activist, to do everything that you can to protect the river, to protect the public lands, to protect the wildlife and the wilderness areas. So I want you to make a vow with me today to be a river protector and to help protect that river for the future generations of all species. Thank you.